Good morning. Today we're going to talk about self-knowledge a little bit. Okay, and what do we know about ourselves? And through my experiences, I found that people don't know themselves very well at all. Um, they don't have access to, like in one experiment I did at one point, people made a series of decisions, like 200 decisions, and they were between left and right. And at the end of the game, I asked them questions like, what was the probability that this occurred? And people would go like 50-50. But the fact is, their behavior throughout 200 trials reveals quite clearly that they understood it was not 50-50. So even though they just sat there, they experienced it, they witnessed it, they behaved accordingly, and yet they still reported, I don't know. Okay? So the only one thing in the universe in which we know better than anybody else, and well, anyway, C.S. Lewis, only one thing in the universe in which we know more about than we could learn from external observation. So, say for example, we think that our behavior is our choice. We think we're not, say for example, we're not influenced by commercials, but others are, right? But not me, or political campaign ads or something. Um, we also think that we have a good ability to predict our future behavior. We don't. When they ask, say for example, in the months leading up to a presidential election, about people's intent to vote, and then after the election, asking people how many did vote, and it just doesn't match. People's intentions far outweigh their. Here's a really interesting, cool study. It's kind of a little off to the side, but I enjoy this one. And you see what you got here from the front. This woman in the front is a participant in a research study. The participant or the woman in the back is, the experimenter that works. And so the hands actually belong to, all right, the hands that you see belong to the woman in the back, okay? But what happens is that they tell that participant in the front, okay, like move your fingers like, in pinch your fingers together. And so the woman's hands are down by her side pinching her fingers together. And the hands that she sees are pinching the fingers together. And so the hands that she sees are not her own, and yet when she sees them, she feels like they are in fact hers. Okay, they're her hands. And it's like very weird. There's another similar one, the rubber hand illusion, but this is social psych, so we'll keep it simpler. Here we've got an interesting graph where we talked about they had people. There you go. Essentially, here's a paragraph filled with positive things. Is it accurate about you? And people are like, yes. Okay. Is it accurate about a close friend? Little less so. And so it turns out the more positive the paragraph was, the more likely you were to say, yes, it sounds like me. And the more negative the paragraph was, the less likely you were to say, yes, that's a good description of me. Okay, so that's kind of funky. William James did a lot of things in psychology. I like William James. He was definitely a pragmatist, right? That's a word he was proud of. And as a pragmatist, he felt nothing was off the table. This was at a time when introspection was starting to get a bad rap. And so William James is basically, if there's something that I can use introspection for, I'm not going to just toss it out, okay? And so he actually he moved into the occult later in his life. He was actually the head of a very, very, very important department at Johns Hopkins University, and or was it Harvard? I think it was Harvard actually. And so he's in charge of the biggest department in the world. And he starts sniffing into the occult as a way to learn about humans. And the Harvard University says, I don't think we want our name associated with the occult. William James, here's your choice. You either quit pursuing the occult, or you resign and go do whatever you want to do. And he chose to resign. Boom. And he actually hired, he got convinced Hugo Munsterberg to come and fill his position. We'll come up to Hugo Munsterberg at some point, I bet, probably in the social psychology in the courtroom, I bet. But anyway, William James had this notion of self-esteem that it was basically a ratio. You see here, self-esteem is the result of successes over pretensions. Pretensions is sort of like attempts or something like that. And so what happens is William James says, okay, you can raise your self-esteem in two different ways. Number one, you can be more successful, right? Because if you look at the fraction, raising the numerator of a fraction will increase the fraction. But the second way to make a fraction larger is to make the denominator smaller. And so William James says, look, all right, here's the deal. If I've been passionately pursuing my career in the NFL, that is a pretension, that is an attempt. I'm sorry. I think there has only been one professional football player ever that is older than I currently am. That might be Jan Stenerud, the kicker. Okay, so chances are I'm not going to the NFL. So guess what? If I give up on the pretension that I'm going to the NFL, all of a sudden the denominator shrinks and self-esteem rises. Okay, pretty powerful. I had a student one time, Scott Tuttle, when I was up at Missouri State University, and he took this equation and he ran with it and did this study here. And in this study, he had people. It was what did they do? Yeah, I can't read it, but yeah, I'm pretty sure that's what it was. He had them imagine hypothetical successes and failures in their life. So he would give them a standard test of self-esteem. Then he would have them imagine successes or failures, and then he would have them take the same test of self-esteem after having imagined these successes or failures. And the self-esteem score that came out at the end mirrored what William James would have expected if these things had happened. It was a pretty good study. I like that one. Anyway, Scott Tuttle ended up going and getting a PhD in rural sociology. Yeah, he joined the Peace Corps, went to Niger, then he went down to Mexico to teach English, and then he came back and got a PhD in rural sociology, and I think he got a faculty position somewhere. I can't remember. But anyway, impressive. Okay, self-efficacy. Self-efficacy is this notion that you're competent, effective. It's different from self-esteem, which is your sense of self-worth. The belief that we're capable. I would put the brakes on this slide when I talk about self-efficacy, because self-efficacy is important. Like, take a look. It's an important component of Erik Erikson's stages of social development. It's this notion of independence, or, I can get things done. It's part of maybe initiative versus guilt or something stage. But I would be willing to bet that once you leave the Western cultures, that this whole discussion of self-efficacy is going to be a whole lot different. If I had to guess, if I were to be studying Asian psychology, I would have to create a new word called group efficacy. Okay, that would be my wildest guess, but I haven't actually gone and done that. Locus of control is, again, a very, very important construct. The locus of control, and again, you can find elements in Erik Erikson's stages of social development that really mirror into this locus of control. So it's the extent to which you believe that, for lack of a better word, you're in charge of the world. The outcomes that happen to you, are you in charge of them? And so if you have what's called an internal locus of control, what it basically means is that you have this idea that successes and failures in your life comes from your efforts. And so what happens is, if that's true, then you're in charge. If you have an external locus of control, then you believe that the outcomes that occur in your life, successes and failures, are really the product of outside forces. So bad things happen, and I can't control them. And clearly locus of control is not a, external versus internal, but it's degrees, right? It's, some are more externally, and we find those that are with an internal locus of control tend to be most healthy. And in fact, learned helplessness tends to arise in people that have a very high external locus of control. And so what happens in a really classic experiment, and don't shoot me, I didn't do the experiment, I'm just reporting on it. Okay, this is Martin Seligman did this famous study. So he put these dogs into a chamber that had a left side and a right side, okay, A and B. And there's a little short wall between them. And what can happen is that he can turn an electrical shock onto the floor, all right? You can turn it on to A or B. So what happens is, this dog is sitting in this chamber, and a light turns on overhead, and then 15 seconds later, the floor gets electrified, and the dog gets shocked. Now, if the dog steps over that little barricade, okay, no problem, because B won't be electrified. If A is, B won't be, okay? So the dog now has 15 seconds to step over the barricade and never get shocked, okay? So The dog, first couple of trials gets zapped and stuff, but pretty soon the dog figures it out. And so as once the dog figures it out, the light comes on, and the dog just doesn't even look like he notices the light, just sort of stands there looking dumb, right? And then, I don't know, 10, 12 seconds later, just steps over the barricade casually and never gets shocked. Okay? It's amazingly cool. Now flash forward and try a second group. Same procedure, except now when they're in chamber A, they are harnessed so that they can't leave. And so when the light comes on, 15 seconds later, they get shocked. Okay? And they can't avoid it. And see, they do this for a little while, and after a while, when the light comes on, the dog just like is defeated. Tail goes down, ears drop, the whole thing. And so, okay, now take off the harness. And now this dog is perfectly capable of just stepping over that barricade, getting away, getting no shock. But guess what? This dog quits. This dog just gets a general sense of helplessness. I couldn't control my world, so what's the point of trying? In other words, this dog had the ultimate in external locus of control. Okay? It's not my efforts that determine my outcomes, it's outside forces. And this learned helplessness is a powerful component of many things, including clinical depression. Okay, it's one of the key elements. They did some pretty powerful. Wow, that is crazy. They did some pretty powerful studies on learned helplessness in certain contexts, such as prisons or, in particular, nursing homes, where the traditional model is that the staff make all decisions. Okay, and so in theory it leads to this learned helplessness because these patients, the outcomes that they receive, even things like when is dinner, what is for dinner, what's on television. And so what happens is in some nursing homes, what they'll do is they'll allow the nursing home people, I'll say patients, but residents is the word. They'll allow the residents to make the choices themselves, and guess what? They're way healthier. It's amazing. I mean, they have lower rates of death. They have lower rates. It's just powerful. But here is wow, I cannot read this for the life of me. But I'm fairly certain that what this is that in the West, this is true. Self-determination leads to a lack of learned helplessness. But in non-Western, in particular Asian nations, this notion of self-choice isn't the same game. Clearly, in Asian societies, people are perfectly happy. See, now in the United States, um, people want to make their own choices. They want to pick their own food. They want to know. In Asian nations, people tend to be perfectly satisfied if the choice that was made by somebody they trust. Okay? So in America, people want their own choices. In Asian cultures, perfectly happy if somebody else made the choice for you. If you trust them. Okay. Self-determination leads to increased life satisfaction, but this is regret theory of decision making. I'm not teaching decision making, but what happens is that generally speaking, the more choices you can make, the better. But if you get overwhelmed with too many choices, then all of a sudden we're afraid we're going to regret. There's a regret theory. We can't settle on a single choice because we're afraid we're going to regret what we didn't choose. Okay, so that's a powerful problem, that excess choice. Ooh, the self-serving bias. Yeah, it's pretty interesting. The self-serving bias is like, I am better than anybody else. My successes are because of me. My failures are because of something outside of me. Anybody ever heard of that about the grades students receiving in college? Not you, of course, but other ones. And so we find that generally speaking, we tend to perceive ourselves in quite self-serving ways. However, what's interesting is, again, in Asian cultures, you don't necessarily see a self-serving bias. In fact, you see false humility. Okay, you see almost the opposite. But you see a group serving bias. Okay, so my group is better than other groups, but me as an individual, I'm going to show some humbleness and humility about it. False humbleness and humility. Okay. Yeah. I really just a couple of definitions you know how to read. So, self-serving bias can be adaptive. All right. It provides motivation. If we believe we're good, it should motivate us to stay good, right? But it can provide overconfidence. Absolutely. It will make us think. I still remember when my daughter was young and she was just learning how to swim. Man, oh man, was she confident. She was convinced that she knew how to swim, and boy, was that dangerous, okay? She couldn't. And so, yeah, there's the group serving bias, which is true in America as well, but much more true in the other nations. Self-presentation. This is actually pretty interesting. Um, this notion of the way I feel about myself privately may or may not match the way I present myself externally. And I mean, clearly, when you get put into a role, I mean, here I am in the role of a professor. So clearly, I must have self presentation of confidence, even if I'm not. Yeah, sometimes I don't know the material quite as well as I. Hey, secret. Okay, so self-presentation is an important concept. It's what you want others to feel about you. The act of expressing oneself and behaving in ways designed to create a favorable impression, or an impression that corresponds to one's ideals, or roles, or the roles that you're in. Self-monitoring is this constant back and forth. What are other people seeing in me? Okay, I'm presenting myself this way. How are others seeing me in this situation? You don't want to get caught into that. That would be bad. Okay. Sometimes people will self-handicap. There'll be self-handicapping is to say, you're about to be given a big project, and you're like, well, I'm not sure I can do it. Therefore, if you succeed at the end, it's a giant victory. But if you fail at the end, it was expected. Okay, so it's a way to lighten the blow from failures. Okay, common influence. Okay, so some ideas about the self here, and so we'll come back in the last lecture from this topic, and we'll talk about self-control, a topic which is near and dear to my heart. So we'll see you the next time.